Thanks very much, Jim, for that kind introduction. Thanks to Joe Bast and Heartland Institute for having me here today, and for all of you for coming out on this cold, cold Chicago day. I feel like it is appropriate that I am here in Chicago on President's Day week, leading into the day on Monday when we celebrate all of our presidents. I kind of liked it when we had Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday, but now it's expanded to all presidents, so as an author of a book about presidents, I'll take advantage of it. But here in the current president's home city, I'm reminded of some recent incidents with the president where the idea that I'm talking about in the book about presidents and pop culture have come up and been really above the fold, very highlighted events. So I think recently in the State of the Union address, President Obama speaking to the nation in an event that is getting less and less attention from the public. When Bill Clinton first started, his first State of the Union address got 67 million watchers. President Obama gets about 30 million watchers, and for the most part, I defy anyone to remember anything that was said in this most recent State of the Union or any State of the Union. It's sort of a forgettable event. But there was one memorable event in this particular State of the Union that kind of bucked the trend of forgettable State of the Unions, and this was with President Obama talking about workplace policies and gender lack of equity in the workplace. He said that we need to get past a society where they have the workplace policies of madmen. And the entire audience laughed, and this one particular moment was the most tweeted moment of President Obama's State of the Union, and as I suggest, probably the only memorable moment of that State of the Union. Not long before that, President Obama met with high-tech CEOs in the White House, and one of them was Reed Hastings from Netflix. And he remarked how much he liked the character Frank Underwood, who is the devious, murderous, blackmailing majority leader in the Netflix series House of Cards, which the new season is starting, if you like that sort of thing. And this moment jumped out at me because here we had the President of the United States talking about a TV character, his moral merits aside, on a show that appeared in a medium that did not exist when George W. Bush was president. That is how fast technology moves and how fast the platforms change these days. And then the third story, which is one that I opened the book with, is about President Obama when he was trying to sell his health care law. I know, Jim, you talked about your Obamacare disaster book and some of the efforts that you made against it. But while he was trying to sell the book, he was making a pretty hard sell and making a pitch in a whole bunch of different places. And one of those places he went to pitch the law was to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And he talked at that event, filled with all the glitterati of Washington and Hollywood. He talked about how hard it was to get this law passed. And in particular, he needed to get a provision through, which was the tanning tax, a tax on tanning salons. And he said that the only way we're going to get it through is if there is an exemption for John Boehner and Snooki. And when I heard this, I was a little flabbergasted that the President of the United States mentioned Snooki from the presidential podium. Not just because of who she is, kind of a foul-mouthed, buxom, not very bright character on TV's Jersey Shore, but just that the president would reduce the stature of the presidency by referring to a character that appeared on a reality TV show, and also one that's really not that well watched. I mean, how many people outside that room knew who Snooki was then, and even less so now? And this came up when President Obama was asked about Snooki on The View, which is one of his favorite shows to appear on. And he was asked on The View something about Snooki, what would happen if Snooki ran for mayor of Wasilla, which I think was some kind of dig at Sarah Palin. And President Obama's response, again, after he'd made this very public joke about her, he said, to be honest, I don't really know who Snooki is. And it struck me at that moment, and helped lead me to come to this effort of writing this book, that was a very strange answer, especially given that he'd publicly mentioned her. And I wonder, it led me to ask this question. Are we better off with a president of the United States who knows who Snooki is, or who doesn't know who Snooki is? And it actually, I had this flash of inspiration. I came up with a title for the book at that moment. And this title was, From Cicero to Snooki, How Our Culture Shapes Our Presidents. Now I wrote up a proposal and I gave this to the publisher. And the publisher said, we like your idea. we don't like your title. And I said, why, pray tell, since I happen to be somewhat enamored of it? And they said, the Venn diagram of those who know who Snooki is and those who know who Cicero is never intersects. There will never be overlap between those two groups. And I must admit, they were kind of right. I see a gentleman over here flipping through the book. You'll see that my introductory chapter is called that, but it is not what is on the front page and what tries to get people to purchase the book. They also did not mention this, but there was another good reason not to name the book with Snooki in the title. Because now, here we are in 2014, and Snooki is unlamentably forgotten, I would say. She's no longer on TV, and nobody really thinks about her or cares about her, or, for the most part, knows who she is. Because the pop culture today is so ephemeral, so evanescent. People briefly show up on the screen, or in your Twitter feed, or on the blogs, and then they are no more. And it's kind of like Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes of Fame. But someone like Cicero, in contrast, his ideas are just as relevant and just as important as they ever were, and will continue to be so. And it was the importance of Cicero's ideas and the ideas of many classical Roman thinkers and the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers that were important to our founders. And so with my book, I decided to go back all the way to the founders and see what were the cultural influences on the people who helped shape this nation, and then go throughout to see the people who presided over it in the subsequent 2 centuries, what continued to be the influences, how did they change, and what does that tell us about America and where it is going. So if you go back, and the title says what Jefferson read, and I consciously chose the verbs on the title because the verbs, the activities that presidents engaged in over time changed, and they were of different character over time. But in Jefferson's day, what options were available to anybody, not just presidents, but to any citizen, if you were interested in either education or entertainment? There were only 2. There was no Twitter, there was no movies, there was no YouTube, there was no Netflix. You had 2 choices. There was reading and the written word. I'm sorry, and the live performance. The written word and live performance. And those were the 2 options. And our founders availed themselves of both of those sets of options. More in terms of books, as we'll see in a moment. But books, you must remember, were very expensive in those days in the colonies. In fact, a first edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776 in the colonies would have cost the equivalent of 615 of today's dollars. It's kind of an expensive book. If you think about it, today, an iPad costs you about that much, sometimes some even cheaper. But an iPad that's fully tricked out with the maximum memory you can purchase can store about 160,000 books. Just think about the contrast, how readily available books are to us. In fact, this library we have around us, if someone in the colonies walked in and saw a library like this, they would think that they were in the home of a millionaire, because books were so expensive back then. And in fact, Jefferson had a library of 6,000 books, despite the enormous cost. He once famously said, "I cannot live without books." Adams, his friend for much of the time, rival for part of the time, he had a library of 3,000 books and complained how he'd bankrupted himself with books. And they talked about books, and they engaged in discussions and intellectual correspondence about books. And the ideas they found in books shaped the revolution that made our nation. They went back and forth so much. At one point, Jefferson wrote to Adams, "Dear sir, how I envy you," because Adams read more books than Jefferson did, or at least Jefferson felt that Adams read more books than he did. But the ideas they found in these books, you can see them in, for example, the Declaration of Independence, which was clearly heavily influenced by the writing of John Locke. And you can see them later on in the Constitution, because Jefferson was asked by Madison, when the Articles of Confederation weren't working so well, for ideas on what makes a good society. And Jefferson, again, remember how expensive books were at the time, sent Madison 2 cratefuls of books on law, on history, on philosophy. And Madison took those 2 cratefuls of books, and he read them, and he wrote a memo to himself that informed his thinking during the Constitutional Convention, during the writing of the Constitution, over which Madison had the primary pen, and in the writing of the Federalist Papers, which defended the Constitution. So the ideas that our founders found in their primary cultural expression of the time were instrumental in developing this great nation that we have before us today. And it's important to remember that at the time, there was a very literate populace. In fact, the literacy rates in the US were much higher than in Europe. And every American home, it seemed, or almost every, people remarked at how common it was in American homes that you would find not only books, but Shakespeare and the Bible. These were common things that you would find in American homes, not just at the Founders era, but throughout the 19th century. And Americans at those times were very literate. If you made references to Shakespeare and the Bible, people understood the references you were making. Now the Founders, because of the society in which they lived, and because the way in which ideas had such an influence on developing our great nation, the Founders had this vision. And their vision was for enlightened leaders, such as themselves, presiding over an educated populace. And one of the themes of my book is how this vision of the enlightened leaders presiding over the educated populace was challenged over time. And there were a number of challenges, really in the two primary forms of challenge. One was small d democracy. It ended up being much rougher and more raucous than the Founders intended. And the second was technology. Now, for the first challenge, we'll talk more about the 19th century for a few moments. The 19th century, after the Founders period, we had a period in which theater was incredibly important. During the colonies, theater, for at some point, was even banned in Boston. The Puritans were not big fans of theater. And there was also a sense throughout much of the colonies that theater was sort of an improper or immoral place to go. That started to fade by the beginning of the 19th century. And we've now had, now looking back today, every American president has attended at least one theatrical performance in their lifetimes. And in the 19th century, if you were running for office or you were an office holder and you wanted to go and see and be seen, you didn't go on Twitter or YouTube or TV. The only choice was to go to live performances. You would go where the people were. And presidents would go on goodwill tours to various locations, to various cities where there were multiple theatrical venues, and that's how they would see and be seen. Now, theater is different from the printed word, obviously, which is static, or even from moving images like TV and movie that followed it, because even though the moving images are moving, they stay the same. So if you are watching a film, whether you are in Chicago or New York, the film is exactly the same. But theatrical performances can vary. And they can vary based on who the actors are, who's in the audience, how the audience is responding, what's going on at the time. And we saw in the 19th century some incidents where political expression developed in the theater. And I tell the story in the book of the great election races between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. These took place in 1824 and 1828. In 1824, John Quincy Adams, who may have been the best prepared president or person ever to be president, he had gone to Harvard, not that that's necessarily a qualification. He spoke Greek and Latin and would translate Greek and Latin into English documents in his spare time for fun. He'd been minister to multiple countries and spoke multiple European languages. He was very well read. He considered becoming a scholar before he went into the family business of politics. But he was not necessarily a man of the people. In 1824, he narrowly defeated Andrew Jackson in the race for president, even though Jackson won a plurality of the electoral vote and the popular vote, not a majority. And the election went to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay backed Quincy Adams. The election swung in Quincy Adams' favor, and Clay became the Secretary of State. This was known almost immediately as the corrupt bargain, and people became very unhappy with it. And so not long after these events unfold, John Quincy Adams goes to the theater in Washington. And the actors, as I said, theater can respond to who is in the house. The actors recognized that John Quincy Adams was in the house, and they ad-libbed references to General Jackson during their performance. And when this happened, the audience cheered lustily every time General Jackson's name was mentioned, embarrassing Quincy Adams, in fact, embarrassing him so much that he was a big theater fan, and he significantly curtailed his theater going after this incident. But it had indicated that Jackson had really captured the hearts of the people. And in 1828, when they had a rematch, Jackson won and didn't have to worry about going to the House of Representatives. He won much more easily. Because he knew how to speak to the people, even though Quincy Adams dismissed him as an unlettered barbarian who didn't know how to spell. It was true, he was a terrible speller. He knew how to reach the American people. When he spoke at, excuse me, at his inauguration, there were 10,000 people there to hear. And during his presidency, he was actually offered an honorary degree at Harvard, something that mortified Quincy Adams. In fact, Quincy Adams went to the president of Harvard himself to complain about this. He could do that because the president of Harvard was his cousin, Josiah Quincy. No matter, Josiah Quincy said the degree was going to go forward, and Jackson did come up to Boston to get the degree. And when he's getting the degree, the people there, the students there, spoke to Jackson in Latin because that was the language of Harvard at the time. But Jackson was no fool, and in fact didn't really speak Latin, and he said, "The only words I know in Latin are three, e pluribus unum," showing that he understood, he had the common touch, he knew how to appeal to people. Another president who was very good with the common touch was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln grew up, hardscrabble poverty, rural area, not a lot of books available, but he loved books, was obsessed with books. We've all heard stories, I'm sure, of him trudging many miles in the snow to get the nearest book. But the truth was there weren't that many books available. I mean, I talked about how expensive books were to Jefferson, but at least Jefferson was a wealthy man and he could order books. And Lincoln really had very few options. But he did have some books at home. And some of the, and some of these books he had at home, because he only had a few of them, he read, and he read over and over and over again. They included the Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's Fables, which he effectively memorized, Parson Weems' Life of Washington. And in doing so, in internalizing these books, in fact, I think we're very lucky that Lincoln had the books he had. Lincoln learned some very important skills for his political life. He learned a common language that everyone understood from the Bible. He learned elevated speech from Shakespeare. He learned how to tell a story to make a point from Aesop's Fables, something that if you watch the movie Lincoln, Lincoln's character annoys the heck out of the defense secretary or the secretary of war at the time by telling his stories, and the guy said, "Please stop with the infernal stories." Well, Lincoln learned that trick from Aesop's Fables. And so Lincoln was obsessed with reading, and reading really made him, it elevated him from his humble, poor, unknown origins into becoming not only our president, but perhaps the greatest president we have ever had. But Lincoln understood Jackson's lesson as well. And he wasn't one to make quotes or cite fancy books that he had read. He knew how to speak to the people in the language that they understood. Even though he was obviously very smart and spoke about elevated ideas, he didn't do it in a snobby way. And so I write in this book in the 19th century that what presidents learned and what politicians learned, and it's a lesson we can still have on this today, that every politician must have some John Quincy Adams in order to govern effectively. But you've got to have some Andrew Jackson in you in order to get elected. And that tension between the common man and the higher ideals is a tension that continues with us till today. You know, in the 20th century, the other challenges came about to this idea of the enlightened leaders and the educated populace. And this came in the form of technology. The technology that was available throughout the 19th century didn't really differ from the founders' time. The major differences, I would say, were the development of the railroad, so goods and services could move around more quickly, and then the power printing press, so you could print more copies of books and they would be more cheap. But the fact is, you were still stuck at the end of the 19th century with just those two options of the printed word and live performance. But in the 20th century, new developments emerged, including the ability to amplify one's voice. This we all know today as radio. This was a seismic change in the way presidents could communicate with everyone else. When Warren G. Harding spoke, the first time a president spoke over the radio as president, I make that caveat because Woodrow Wilson gave a speech over the radio after he was president, but before Harding's speech. But in any event, Harding speaks over the radio for the first time as president, and he reached 125,000 people. You know, he was nowhere near the politician that Andrew Jackson was, but just think about it. He reached 12 times as many people as Jackson had at his inaugural address. And Calvin Coolidge, in fact, was known as Silent Cal Coolidge, but he was a very savvy radio operator. He knew how to speak over the radio, and he used the tool very effectively in his presidency. But even though he was a pretty good radio president, he obviously paled before the most famous radio president we have, and that everyone knows is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, the interesting thing about FDR is that he was a skilled radio user even before he became president. Everyone knows about the fireside chats. But he gave two famous speeches in 1924 and 1928 at the Democratic National Conventions, where he had this insight that not everybody had at the time, that he wasn't just speaking to the people in the room. He was speaking to people broadcast all over the country over the radio. And this is something we see right now. I'm speaking to the good people in this room, but I'm also obviously speaking to the camera that will be broadcast and amplified in other ways. But I know this because I'm a product of the 21st century. This was a new idea for Roosevelt, and people actually commented on the time how skillful he was and how he was clearly speaking beyond just the people in the room, and he was taking advantage of the radio. FDR, of course, wasn't the only savvy radio person in his own family. After he won the nomination in 1932, in part because of those successful addresses in 24 and 28, he called his mother, like a good boy, and told her that he had won the nomination. And his mother's response was, "I know that. I already heard it over the radio." Now, as president, we all know about him and the fireside chats, but what most people don't know is that the fireside chats were rarely deployed. He didn't give fireside chats every week, as some people seem to think. He gave them 2 or 3 times a year because he was very concerned about the possibility of being overexposed. In fact, he thought that Winston Churchill, who spoke brilliantly and regularly over the radio in Britain, he thought Churchill was overexposed. Now, to be fair to Churchill, FDR didn't have to deal with Nazi bombers blitzkrieging London on a nightly basis, so maybe Churchill had a reason for going on the radio more often. But nevertheless, FDR took those speeches very seriously. He had a bit of a gap between his teeth that created a whistle when he spoke, and he put in a false tooth when he gave his fireside chat so you wouldn't hear the whistle over the radio. He used a special paper that didn't rustle, so that when he spoke, people would think he was speaking off the cuff, even though he was looking at a text in front of him. And with respect to that text in front of him, he went through it carefully and crossed off all the $5 and $10 words, all the big shot fancy words that his highly educated speechwriters had put in there for him, because he knew he was trying to reach out to the American people, to speak to them in their common language. And even though FDR was a product of a very wealthy, WASPy family, and even though he'd gone to Harvard, he knew how to reach the people. In fact, there's a great story that when the Queen of England came to America to visit with FDR, FDR insisted on serving hot dogs to show his common touch. Now, radio was only one technological development of the 20th century. The other came in the form of the moving image. So first you had film, and FDR was the most filmed president for many years. In fact, FDR was, we all know now that he was in a wheelchair, but in all those movie appearances, he was never shown in a wheelchair as president on film until Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor in 2001 or so. So there was, he was shown in Sunrise at Campobello, which is about how he got paralyzed, but that was showing him before he was president in his wheelchair. And one person actually questioned me on this point and said that, what about in the Little Orphan Annie movie, in the Annie the Musical, there's an FDR character who's shown in a wheelchair. I'm not sure that one actually counts because it's a cartoon, but nevertheless. So the film industry protected FDR and took very good care of him. In fact, FDR was the first president to assemble groups of celebrities to back his campaigns, and he would have these events at the Hollywood Bowl where people like Lon Chaney and Humphrey Bogart would get together, and they would assemble all these celebrities who would back FDR. Because of the power of not only the moving image, but the ability to distribute it through silver screens across the country, having these celebrity backers became something that was very valuable in the 20th century, and FDR was one of the first to recognize that. But in the second half of the 20th century, we had the merging of these two technologies, the ability of the image to move on screen, the ability to amplify your voice, and you bring them together in television, and that shows up in everybody's home. And television really changed the way that we interact with our presidents, and did so in a number of ways. So, first of all, presidents find television to be a source of entertainment. Dwight D. Eisenhower watched so much TV when he was president that the social secretary complained at the degree to which the TV schedule set the social schedule in the Eisenhower White House. Now, before we criticize Eisenhower, think about it. This is before DVR, this is before DVD, this is before VCR, Netflix. If you missed that episode of I Love Lucy, you were out of luck. And in fact, this happened to Ike. He witnessed this firsthand because his inauguration coincided with the famous episode of I Love Lucy in which little Ricky is born. And little Ricky's birth episode got more viewers than the Ike inauguration. And this got under Ike's skin. In fact, 10 years later, after he was no longer president, he saw Lucille Ball. And he said to her, she had her 10-year-old child with her at the time, and he said, "Is this the little boy who took away all the attention from my inauguration?" Now Lucy had to explain to Ike that the actor Little Ricky was not the same as her son Little Ricky. But nevertheless, the point is that Ike was quite aware of what had happened and how the thunder was stolen from his inauguration. But that said, Ike understood the other side of TV as well, not just the receiving it and the enjoying it as a watcher, as someone who's entertained, but as the ability to project yourself on screen to the masses. And he was the first president to have a televised news conference, just period, first president to have a televised news conference. He was the first president to have an outside Hollywood advisor. The actor Robert Montgomery came to help him out and guide him on his TV performances. And the most famous words from the Eisenhower administration, the military-industrial complex, came from his farewell address on TV. So Ike knew what he was doing when it came to TV, but he was a bit of a piker when it came to who came after him, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the first president who really understood TV. Some of this credit has to go to his father, Joseph Kennedy, who was a Hollywood exec back in the 20s and 30s. He ran multiple studios. I don't know how that was even possible. There was one point where he was running 3 or 4 different studios, but he was quite the wheeler dealer. But as early as 1952, he was haranguing JFK about the appearance and the importance of being on TV and how TV can convey your image. And in that 1960 campaign, many of us know the famous story of the debate that Nixon had with Kennedy. And Nixon was kind of cocky going into that debate because he thought he was more experienced and more knowledgeable about foreign affairs. But it didn't matter because the people who listened to that debate may have thought Nixon did better. But the people who watched it on TV overwhelmingly thought Kennedy was the winner. And in fact, Ike, who I said was kind of TV savvy, had warned Nixon not to debate Kennedy on TV because he knew that Kennedy was pretty good at this. And Ike watched the debate with Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister of Britain. And Macmillan said after watching the debate that to Ike that your boy lost tonight, meaning your boy meaning Nixon. And he said that Kennedy comes off as some kind of eager undergraduate, but Nixon comes off as someone who might be an ex-convict or something of the sort. So I guess he knew what he was talking about there. So Kennedy was very good at TV. He understood how to convey himself over TV. When he was president, he gave a series of live press conferences from the White House that were masterful, and he had the White House press corps laughing the entire time. Unlike Ike, he did unedited live press conferences. Ike did edited and recorded ones. And Kennedy also recognized how important TV was in that 1960 campaign. First of all, though he palled around with a lot of celebrities and did more than pal around with certain starlets, he was very wary of being too closely associated with Hollywood, and in fact told his campaign staff in 1960, don't have me doing too many events with these Hollywood celebrity types. And Frank Sinatra was a huge backer of Kennedy in 1960, but it's not like Kennedy was doing public events with him because he saw there was possible danger of being too closely affiliated with a celebrity. But he was very skillful on TV, and it helped get him elected, not just through the debate. And after he was elected, he recognized how important TV was to his campaign because at one point he walked by a TV after he was already elected president, and he said, we never would have had a chance without that gadget. So he recognized how important TV was. So TV had this dual purpose of something that could entertain, but also a way that presidents could convey themselves to the masses. And this brought about an interesting shift. Because when this happens, you have the situation where presidents don't just watch TV, as it is said, they are TV. They are not only on TV, but they're the most common person you see on TV. We're past the date where, let's say, a Walter Cronkite would dominate the evening news, or even back in the day when Johnny Carson was on TV, he had no competition, and now we see Fallon and Leno and Letterman, and there's a whole raft of these guys. Nobody dominates TV like the president. The president is the most viewed person on TV and the most joked about person by the late night comics. Now sometimes this is problematic for a president. When Bill Clinton, for example, had the Monica Lewinsky scandal raging around him, he decided to go away for a little bit of a vacation with Hillary and with Terry McAuliffe, who is now the governor of Virginia. On this vacation, they decided to watch a little TV. And Hillary had the remote, and she's flipping through the channels, and every channel has something about the scandal, and it's driving her crazy. You go to the news channels, they're talking about the scandal. You go to the comedians, they're talking about the scandal. Even sitcoms, it seems, can ad-lib references to the scandal. She was sick of it. She didn't want to hear anything more about it. And so she finally settled on a channel that didn't have the scandal on it. And that channel was not her favorite, but it was ESPN. And so for that night, it worked for her. But on that same vacation, McAuliffe reports that the White House stewards came by and asked if anybody would like some wine. And Hillary said no. And Bill, who really didn't drink very much, said no. And McAuliffe said, "I'll take the bottle, please." Who can blame him? Now we are in a new era. So these technological developments I talked about happened perhaps quickly if you look at the entire sweep of history, but relatively slowly in that it took some time to develop from TV to radio, or from radio to TV, and the development of film from silent to talkie. These things took place over multiple decades. Now we're having a situation I suggested earlier, where you have these rapidly new developing technological platforms. And so President Obama is talking about a character on a show that, in a medium that didn't exist when George W. Bush was president. In 2008, everybody marveled about how skillful Obama was on Facebook, but by 2012, they were talking about how he has 40 million followers on Twitter. And so these things happen very quickly. I've noticed for one of the 2016 possible candidates, Rand Paul, has opened up a Snapchat account, perhaps thinking that will help get the youth voters. I don't know if anybody here has used Snapchat, but anybody over 22, I think, is going to find it incredibly annoying because somebody sends you a message, you open it, and it disappears. So if you sneeze or you blink, it's gone. So I don't get the point, but maybe Rand Paul is on something. We'll see. But Obama, as I mentioned earlier, has been very skillful at using pop culture to his advantage. This, in part, comes from his pop culture suffused upbringing. I have in the book a section where I recount directly from his memoir, I quote directly from his memoirs, about his childhood growing up in Hawaii. And he was going to the elite school of Punahou, which is the best school in Hawaii. And he says that when he left school for the day, he would go to the comic book store to see what comic books were new and available. Then he would go home and watch cartoons. Then he would watch sitcom reruns. Then he would watch primetime TV with his grandfather until Johnny Carson came on, at which point his grandfather would send him to bed, and he would listen to top 40 music over the radio until he went to sleep. Now, I don't know if any of you are parents in the room. I assume some of you are. You shouldn't do that with your kids. Try something else. But President Obama grew up with his grandparents, not directly with his parents. In fact, when his father, Barack Obama Sr., did come to visit him in Hawaii, the only time Obama ever saw his father beyond when he was a toddler, so he came when Obama was between 10 and 12, and he commented, not happily, about how much TV Obama watched, and he tried to get him to turn off the TV at one point. And his grandparents thought that this was because the TV was disturbing Barack Obama Sr., and he said, "It's okay." They said, "It's okay, Barry, you can go into the other room to watch your show." The show, by the way, was The Grinch That Stole Christmas. So, Obama remembers that in his memoir. And Barack Obama Sr. says, "No, that's not what I mean. He's got to turn that thing off, turn off that contraption." So he had this, even though he only saw him for that brief period, he had this sense that his son was watching too much TV. And the truth is, his son watched a ton of TV as a youth, but if he had just continued on that path, he would have gone to the couch potato path that too many Americans face. And the truth is, he did shake himself off that, and he started to read a lot more, especially in college, although he still watches more TV, than I would argue, than any president except perhaps Reagan and Eisenhower. I think those three were probably the biggest TV watchers. Obama likes the TV shows, I say in the book, of the 1% rather than the 99%. He likes kind of gritty, edgy shows that you'll see on pay cable. Think The Wire, Mad Men, which I said he mentioned in the State of the Union, Breaking Bad is something he's watched, Boardwalk Empire, Homeland, he's a big fan of Homeland. In fact, he's been known to sneak away and go to his office on Saturdays and close the door and pretend to be working and actually be watching Homeland. And at one point, when he was told about a possible sleeper cell in the US of Muslim terrorists, he said, "Oh, it sounds like Homeland." So he watches these shows and they obviously stick with him. But he's used pop culture very cleverly. So in the 2012 campaign, for example, when he was running for re-election that some people thought was going to be a very tough fight, and it was a tough fight, he won, but it was a tough fight against Mitt Romney, he appeared many times, and quite frequently, in soft media entertainment venues. He wasn't going on Meet the Press or Face the Nation to take tough questions from the White House press corps. What he was doing was he was going on shows like a New Mexico DJ where he was asked about what his favorite superpower would be. It was the ability to translate any language, by the way. Or whether he liked green chilies or red chilies. He went on the Pimp with a Limp show in Florida. He went on The View 6 times. He went on the Leno show 6 times. Not all in 2012, but he's the first president to go on a late night comedic show as president. Now, whenever I say this, people say, well, what about Clinton and Arsenio Hall? Clinton did that famous performance on Arsenio Hall with the saxophone and the sunglasses. That was before he was president. He was still governor of Arkansas. And Nixon appeared on Laugh-In in 1968 and said the famous line, "Suck it to me," although he messed it up and said, "Suck it to me." And again, that was before he was president. So Obama's the first president to do this as president. And he was very cleverly blanketing his target audiences in doing this. He slow jammed the news with Jimmy Fallon and talked about student loans in order to win over youth voters. As I said, he went on The View multiple times because he was trying to reach women voters. And those 2 DJ shows I mentioned in South Florida and New Mexico, it's not coincidental that both of those are in swing states. So President Obama was skillful about using pop culture in terms of where he appeared and what he talked about. One of those shows he talked about how he liked Carly Rae Jepsen's song to work out to. Now, in contrast, his opponent was Mitt Romney. And when Mitt Romney made pop culture references, as he did occasionally, he referred to shows like Seinfeld or a movie like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Big show, I know, big hit in Chicago. Both of those, while I think were very funny, were past their moment, 2 and 3 decades old, respectively. And so the cultural references that Romney was making were not necessarily ones that were resonating with today's audience or with the voters he needed to bring out. And in fact, Obama, in 2008, got 18% of the electorate was youth voters, and he won overwhelmingly with those voters. Now in 2012, everybody said that number was unsustainable. It had never happened that the youth voted, the share of the electorate was so high, it wasn't going to happen again. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Romney people thought they were going to win was because their adjustments of the polls, they skewed the polls based on what they thought the electorate was going to look like. And they were wrong, because thanks in part to this pop culture strategy, Obama got 19% share of the electorate was youth voters. So he got even higher than 2008, which is itself a record-breaking number. The other thing that Obama does is he deals a lot with celebrities. This helps in 3 ways. Number one is there's this issue of reflected glory or coolness. You hang out with celebrities, you appear cool. In some ways it can increase your stature. Now, depending on which celebrities you choose, it could also decrease your stature. Let's say the celebrity has a well-known drug problem or is a tempestuous personal life. But for the most part, hanging out with celebrities can help you and make you look better. The second thing is celebrities happen to be rich. It's no accident that Eva Longoria from Desperate Housewives was the deputy chairman of his campaign. She was a very good fundraiser, and George Clooney was a huge fundraiser. In fact, Obama appeared at a Hollywood fundraiser in 2012 and said, "You guys are going to have to carry me like you did in 2008. And then the third way that celebrities help is they are amplifiers of your message. They have active Twitter accounts, and they can tweet to all their followers, go vote or go support President Obama. They go on the late night talk shows and they say, "I'm backing President Obama." And in fact, even after the 2012 election, President Obama called a bunch of these celebrities to the White House and urged them to go out and support his health care law, and to go out when they go on late night shows and talk about it, or when they are interviewed, or when they are on their Twitter feeds. And a lot of them went and did it. Hasn't really helped the rollout of the health care law, but that's a different story. The fact of the matter is it did help him politically, both in 2008 and 2012. And so that's where we stand today, my friends. We are in a society, in a culture, in a moment where pop culture is very important to the electorate, and it's one of the few ways that you can actually connect to people. And I can't promise to know what the next technological platform is or what the next pop culture trend is. But whoever wants to be successful at winning the White House in the future needs to be aware of it and needs to come up with strategies for dealing with it. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions. Sir.
I've been going through the index.
I noticed. The Washington Read, it's called.
I have a mind that picks up on things that are absent.
Okay.
And among the absentees are Jack Kemp, Art Laffer, John Maynard Keynes. And can you tell me what was it about them that disqualified them for inclusion?
Okay, well, first of all, on the index, there's a great story that William F. Buckley, in one of his books, sent a copy of the book to Norman Mailer in New York. And Norman Mailer gets the book, and of course he immediately goes to the index to do what's called that Washington Read, and he finds under his entry in the book the words written from William F. Buckley, "Hello, Norman." So the Washington Read is a time-honored tradition. Look, the book is about presidents and pop culture. Jack Kemp ran for president but didn't quite make it. He ran for president and didn't make it, ran for vice president, also didn't make it. Art Laffer was very influential to a circle of intellectuals in D.C. With the famous Laffer curve written on the napkin. But his influence on Reagan was less direct. It was mostly the people who he influenced Reagan. And then John Maynard Keynes, first of all, not an American figure, and I bet you, I'm sure Kennedy read some works by Keynes. So I mean, maybe I could have gotten in there in the chapter on reading, but it just wasn't a directly relevant character to the manuscript. So,
but I did find Milton Friedman.
Well, Milton Friedman was in there because Ronald Reagan would read books by Milton Friedman. Reagan actually had this reputation of someone who wasn't much of a reader, but he actually did like to read serious works of nonfiction. And at one point, Reagan was reading one of these serious works of nonfiction, and his press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, came up to him and said, "Well, Mr. President, why don't we put this out there and let people know that you're reading this serious work of nonfiction instead of the typical Louis L'Amour novels that they think you read?" And he said, "You know, Marlin, I don't think we need to do that. And the reason I don't know what serious work of nonfiction it was is because Reagan didn't let it get put out there." So that's why Friedman's in the book. Good question. And also, I will say that, unique question, one I've never gotten before. Joe.
Do liberals have a natural advantage with new media? Do conservative ideas lend themselves most to books, while liberal ideas are more easily communicated with new media?
I don't believe that. I think conservative ideas are easily communicated, and I think that, if you think about Ronald Reagan's message, what was it? Less crime, tough on the Soviet Union, lower taxes. You can easily communicate that via a tweet. You can put that out there in whatever media you want. And in fact, I would argue that conservatives are in a better position today from the media perspective than they were 30 years ago when Reagan was in business. Because when I was growing up, the only news source I had was the New York Times. Delivered to my home every day, that's what we read, that's what we knew, and there were no other options. There was no National Review online. There was no, I couldn't follow my favorite conservative journalists on Twitter. So I think there are more ways of getting the conservative message out. There's certainly no conservative talk radio. So I think there are more ways of getting the conservative message out. And you see in the response to the Affordable Care Act. If the Affordable Care Act had passed 30 years ago, without these other ways of getting the message out, and without these conservative scholars, some of who are fellows here at Heartland, the American people would have said, okay, well, that law passed, and we will never hear anything bad about it because there's no one out there to criticize it. So there's more ways for us to communicate our message, and I think as long as we have the right simple message, we can do it. However, you are correct about pointing out something else, that liberals do have an advantage in this pop culture sphere, because Hollywood is clearly on the side of the Democrats, and they back them with their money, with the messages they put in their films, with the celebrity palling around that I talked about. And when conservatives even try to refer to a show, they are often given the back of the hand. So Mitt Romney, I talked about Romney's references to Seinfeld and Ferris Bueller, but at one point Ann Romney mentioned that they liked the show Modern Family. Now Obama has also said he liked the show Modern Family, and he watches it with Michelle and the girls. And the Modern Family people responded to Obama's show of favoritism towards the show by doing a fundraiser for him, big fundraiser with the cast of Modern Family. When Ann Romney said something nice about Modern Family, the show's producer, Steve Levitan, sent out a nasty tweet saying, well, maybe if you guys like gay marriage, we'll let you show up. If you guys support gay marriage, we'll let you show up on the show, or something like that. So it's true that conservatives have a natural disadvantage in Hollywood and with the mainstream media. But I think conservatives have a message that can be put out there in an understandable way. I think that conservatives now have more platforms for putting that message out. And I also think there are even pop culture formats that conservatives could take advantage of. You think of a show like Duck Dynasty, that's a big hit. The guys who are on the show are clearly conservatives, and the audience is clearly conservative. And you listen to the liberal media, they don't understand the show. And then there are places like NASCAR. NASCAR is a great way for conservatives to get their message out. And in fact, when liberals show up at NASCAR events, they routinely get booed. So if conservatives know how to play the cultural game correctly, they can have some success there. But you are right that there's a bit of an uphill battle. Yes?
Well, it's really, you had a really interesting talk about all
Thank you.
different kinds of media and different platforms for it. What do you think about the fact that anybody can set up a Twitter handle now? Anybody can communicate. Where there used to be a time when there was an arbiter, so producer for a radio show, producer for TV, publisher for a book. I mean, we live in a world where anybody can have 15 minutes of fame now.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think it's great. I think that, I'm interested in what Jerry Seinfeld has to say. I can follow him on Twitter. I mean, I could pick whatever I'm interested in and follow that thing. I think that's a great thing. I still think there are these arbiters that you mentioned. I mean, I'm out here selling a book. I could put out as many tweets as I want about the book, and people who follow me on Twitter have probably seen more than their share of tweets about my book. But at the same time, if you want to get on Morning Joe or C-SPAN or on reviewed in the New York Times Book Review, or wherever you might want to get, there are these mediators who are still making the determination of who gets what and who goes where. So I think we're in an area where you still have these cultural arbiters who determine a lot, but Twitter gives people an opportunity to break out in a way that they haven't before. Good question. Yes, sir.
Didn't the Kennedy administration kind of go against the grain of this common touch? They developed this pseudo-sophisticated atmosphere. It's been a long while, but I think I remember Kennedy's favorite reading were James Bond novels.
That's true.
And of course there were stories about his books being ghostwritten.
Yep.
People seem to be attracted to his, maybe it was more Mrs. Kennedy than anything else, creating an atmosphere, but the Camelot atmosphere that
Yep.
really, looking at his personality, wasn't there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I talk extensively about all the things you mentioned in the book. So in terms of Camelot, I think the evidence is pretty strong that he really wasn't listening to that play and to that musical in the way that Mrs. Kennedy suggested in her famous interview with Teddy White. In fact, Arthur Schlesinger dismissed it pretty handily. And he said that anybody, not only was it not true, but that anybody who would have suggested it to Jack would have been laughed at by Kennedy himself. His books were pretty clearly ghost-written. I don't think there's any doubt that his book Profiles in Courage, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, was ghost-written. And I talk extensively about the various historical questions about it. But Kennedy did try to convey this intellectual air. It's something I talk about a lot in my first book on intellectuals in the American presidency. I'll get you one sec. I promise your next question. So he did try and convey this intellectual air. And in fact, the most famous event of the Kennedy administration was the Pablo Casals dinner, where Pablo Casals came with his cello and played for the White House, and it was the first time he was appearing in the U.S. in decades. It was a big deal. He brought all the intellectual establishment together. People raved about Kennedy and how wonderful it was that he brought artists to the White House. But the dirty secret of that event, and I talk about it in the book, is that Kennedy didn't know who Pablo Casals was. didn't have much interest in classical music at all, and in fact had to have handwritten notes from the White House social secretary instructing him when it was appropriate to clap at a classical music performance. So there was definitely a bit of cultural fakery going on in the Kennedy administration. Good question. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it wasn't really a question, it just was brought up by the Camelot thing. I remember a while back at the time when the movie came out, Camelot, and I had taken my late husband to see the film, and we went together, and he said, Nancy, I can't take this, and he walked out. Because he knew something that I didn't know at the time. He suspected what was about the Kennedy, having lived it before, you know, and known the Kennedy and what they did, and how false it was, and he just couldn't take it, so he walked out of the movie.
Wait, was this the movie of the play, or this is the movie about the Kennedy
It was
administration?
about the Kennedys, yes,
Okay.
yes. Fun, yes.
Great. Yes, James.
I think the democratization really of communication through platforms like Twitter, especially, I think it is made the silos of people, of like-minded people more solid than they used to be. I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot as you are, and you can make your favorite person's column in your tweet deck so that you're always seeing what they're up to, and they're kind of going off in the background, and you can retweet that because that's funny. And there's a lot of good humor going on Twitter with guys like Jonah Goldberg, who we both know, and John Gabriel from FreedomWorks and those kind of guys. It's a lot of fun, but it seems like there's a club happening here on the right and the left where we're not really interacting much anymore. And I think that dynamic is true. I'd like you to comment on it. And secondly, what that means is that the grander pop culture, the control of Hollywood by the left, that every leftist message and big government message is treated with admiration and through the pop culture, means that the conservatives, no matter how democratized social media gets, no matter how easy it is to quote-unquote broadcast your views to the world, it's not really going to have much of an effect. And I think that's proven over the last 2 elections because the left has so much strangle control over the broader culture that conservatives will never be able to get traction with.
Well, first of all, I never use the word never, except to say I use the word never. Second of all, I'm not sure I agree with you about the silos on Twitter, because I follow a lot of people on the left, and I know people on the left follow me, and I'm conscious of that when I tweet. That there are things you might say in the clubhouse that you might not say in the broader world. So I'm very conscious of that on Twitter. So I think there's actually been more interaction between left and right as a result of Twitter than you're suggesting. In terms of Hollywood stranglehold on ideas, I mean, you're not going to get a sitcom that embraces conservative ideas. I mean, on the mainstream media or the 3 main networks, let's say. But sometimes I think they miscalibrate. So I tell the story in the book of Gary David Goldberg, who is a big liberal, very hostile to the Reagan administration, and he was the creator of Family Ties. And he put this character on the show, and he thought he was really going to stick it to the Republicans, Alex P. Keaton. And he thought Alex P. Keaton, maybe some of the younger people in the audience don't even recognize the reference, but he was played by Michael J. Fox, and he was this caricature of a young Republican. And the truth of the matter was that he became the most beloved character on the show because people liked what he had to say. And the hippie parents, they didn't care so much about. And so sometimes I think liberals miscalculate about the message that they send out there. They think everybody agrees with them, so that when they put these messages out there that in a sort of mindless way, they don't really think about it, then sometimes they actually help advance conservative ideas. But the fact of the matter is, the basic truth that you're saying is correct, that the products you see, the mainstream products you see from Hollywood are going to be biased to the left. And I remember going to hear Stuart Stevens, who is Romney's strategist, speak early on in the 2012 campaign cycle. And he said, if you are a Republican candidate or a strategist for a Republican candidate, and you're running for president, you just have to recognize that when it comes to the media, you're like the away team. They will always get the calls. But you can't whine about it. You need to come up for strategies with dealing with it. Now, we can argue that the Romney campaign didn't come up with enough good strategies to deal with it, but I thought it was an important and interesting insight. Sir?
Is it still possible that a politician, a president, can be overexposed? I mean,
Absolutely.
Obama's
Yeah,
been on
absolutely.
Leno issues a bunch of times, and yet his popularity has dropped to the 30%.
Yes, I've got an answer to this. So, Obama did, as I said, this kind of full-on pop culture assault in 2012. Shows up on Leno and Letterman and The View and all these shows. And it was very successful for him politically. It was a good strategy. It worked. It got him reelected, and so in that sense, it was politically smart. However, this question of overexposure is a very good and very important one, because not that long into his second term, and I remind people that we are only 1 year into Obama's second term. I know for some on both the Obama team and outside it seems like 10, but it's only 1 year into the Obama second term. And in fact, President Obama has more time left in office than John Kennedy served. Think about that. But the fact of the matter is that within 1 year of his second term, there was a situation in Syria. Over 100,000 people have died, some of them by chemical weapons. And he got up to give a traditional White House address on this issue and what we should do about it. And it landed with a thud. I would say this is universally agreed on both sides of the aisle. And the American people just didn't seem very interested in what he had to say about it. And I posit that perhaps this happened as a result of the overexposure he had in all these pop culture forums and these soft media formats. Because here's this guy who's talking about fun stuff like Carly Rae Jepsen or his favorite superpower on David Letterman or Leno, shows you like to watch, and then suddenly he's showing up in this very boring, staid, boxy environment of the White House address, talking about what is a bummer of an issue of chemical weapons in Syria. And I argue that this previous overexposure in the formats in which he was overexposed may be hurting his ability to speak about more serious topics to the American people. And so that is an open question about Obama. But more importantly, I think it's an open question about the presidency. Will his overexposure in pop culture formats lead to a situation where future presidents, A, feel that they have to go out in the pop culture formats to the same extent as Obama, and also does the diminution of the stature of the presidency and the diminution of the gravitas of the presidency that you'll see when you have this kind of interaction with pop culture, will that carry on and convey to future administrations as well? And that I will leave to you as an open question.
A couple more questions we have time for?
I've got a couple.
Presidential prerogative, take it.
Okay, and we could actually get through all 12 of these if you had short answers to my short questions. So were Obama's books ghostwritten?
No.
No.
Well, his first book, Dreams of My Father's, I don't believe was ghostwritten. There was no reason for it to have been ghostwritten at the time. I think it was beautifully written. I actually was a fan of the book. But there are things he said in that book that you would not have said if you were actually planning to try and become president, like that thing where he talked about the drugs he used and he said sometimes a little blow, which is a quote. I just don't think you would say that if you were really trying to run for president having some ghostwriting.
All right. Are you familiar with any other authors who have written a first book that good with virtually no writing before that?
I think a lot of authors appear with out of nowhere and actually have a very good first book. So, did I think Simon Schuster was the publisher? Did they help him with the editing process? I don't know. Maybe, but I don't think it was a ghostwritten book.
We talked about how the left is well represented in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Has it always been that way, or?
No. There's a book I just read, I just reviewed for the Weekly Standard, called When Hollywood Was Right. And it argues that there was a period in the 1940s and 50s when there were actually three parties in Hollywood. The Republicans, the Democrats, and the Communist parties. And the Republicans in Hollywood were actually pretty influential until almost 1980, and they helped Ronald Reagan. They elevated Ronald Reagan throughout his career, helped him become governor and eventually president.
So there's some literature on whether watching TV, especially when kids watch a lot of TV, it has an effect on their brain. It rewires their brain. It actually has an ongoing influence on their ability to think in a linear or multi-step fashion. Do you believe that? Do you think that's good science?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer. I do know that I probably watched too much TV growing up, just like President Obama did.
Which is why you can't answer the question. So when are we supposed to start clapping during classical music? I've never. I think we all wait until somebody else starts to applaud.
I think it's you wait till someone more knowledgeable than you actually can.
Right. And finally, Steve Hayward did an article maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. I think the title was "Are Conservatives Brain Dead?" It was the title of it. And he said that we've kind of gone past the golden age of conservative writers, and where's today's Hayek or Mises or Milton Friedman, and that there's been a real decline in the intellectual capacity of the conservative movement. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I think the answers to these things become clearer in the fullness of time. So I was at the AEI dinner recently, American Enterprise Institute. And this is a great dinner. It always brings together kind of the luminaries of Washington. And I remember going in the early 90s or late 80s. And I remember looking around and saying, wow, you've got people here like Judge Borg, Gene Kirkpatrick, Irving Kristol, Norbert Horowitz. And I said, wow, these are really the luminaries of the conservative movement. And I went this last year and I said, wow, where are those people? But you look around and who is there? You have Charles Krauthammer, Jonah Goldberg, John Bolton, and Arthur Brooks. Now, I'm not sure we can judge all of those people's full bodies of work yet, and obviously the first 4 people I mentioned were very impressive. But I would argue that those last 4 people, thanks to Twitter and Fox News, are better known to the American people today than those other 4 people were known in their time. I don't know if that makes them better thinkers or better writers, but I do think we have some impressive talent today, and I think we just need to. I think the problem is now that there are so many good conservative writers that it's hard to have those few stand above everybody else. Back then, it was a relatively narrow club. So I'm optimistic about the future of conservative thinkers.